Welcome to the deep dive. You guys ready to explore a theory that just might completely flip your understanding of history?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Did Jesus actually travel to India after the crucifixion?
Whoa. Now that's a fascinating concept. Really challenges what we think we know about Jesus' life and his death, and that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today.
Perfect. Okay, so the source material for our deep dive today is a book. It's called Jesus in India, a treatise written by Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who was the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. This book lays out a pretty compelling argument that suggests Jesus may have survived the crucifixion and then journeyed east.
Yeah, and the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, to this day, they believe that Jesus did indeed travel to India and he lived through the crucifixion.
Interesting. Ahmad's book, by the way, it's structured into 10 chapters plus an epilogue, but he had planned a second part to include further proofs.
Oh, right.
Sadly, it was never written.
That's a bummer. Makes you wonder what else he might have uncovered.
I know. But you know what? Let's dive into what we do have.
Okay, sounds good.
Ahmad, the author, he claims that Jesus traveled through Persia and Afghanistan.
Wow, that's a long way.
Long way, right? Finally reaching Kashmir, where he eventually died.
Driven by a mission to find the lost tribes of Israel, he says.
And there's even a tomb in Srinagar that some people say is Jesus' final resting place.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And get this, Ahmad's argument goes even further. He also claims that Buddhists in India actually incorporated Jesus' teachings into their own beliefs.
Oh, wow. Like a mixing of religious ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Suggesting this really fascinating connection between, these different faiths. So to support this theory, Ahmad, he pulls from all kinds of sources. He uses gospel accounts, the Quran and Hadith, historical records. He even pulls from medical texts.
Oh, wow. He really did his homework.
He did. Like, for example, he brings up the gospel accounts of Jesus appearing to his disciples after the crucifixion.
Right.
And showing his wounds, as proof that he was physically present.
Ah, I see, yeah. He interprets those appearances as evidence that Jesus didn't die on the cross, but instead he went into, a swoon-like state and was able to recover later on.
Exactly. And the whole showing his wounds thing, he uses that as further proof that Jesus was really there, physically present, and interacting with his followers after the crucifixion.
Interesting.
He also cites Quranic verses and Hadith, and these are interpreted as supporting the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross.
Right. Well, that definitely shows how these religious texts, how they can be understood in so many different ways. It all depends on your perspective, really.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really, really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Ahmad brings in this medical evidence, quote unquote. It's an ointment known as the Marhem-i-Isa.
Marhem-i-Isa. Never heard of that.
Have you ever heard of this?
No, this is new to me.
Well, it's mentioned in a bunch of these historical medical texts, like from both Europe and Asia.
Oh, wow.
Supposedly, this ointment was used to treat Jesus' wounds.
Interesting. Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this.
Ahmad argues that because this ointment was known across multiple continents, that this strengthens its historical significance, which then supports his theory, right, about Jesus traveling all the way to the east.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
If this ointment really was used on Jesus, and it was known in both Europe and Asia, then he must have traveled between those regions.
Right.
Right.
He keeps going, though. He brings in all these historical accounts that he believes back up his claims. For example, he mentions coins that were supposedly found in the Punjab. They have Jesus' name inscribed on them in Pali characters.
Wait, really? Coins with Jesus' name on them? In India?
Yeah.
Wow. Those coins, if they're the real deal, I mean, that's got to be a pretty big piece of the puzzle.
Definitely. And he also goes into stories from a couple of books, Razat Safa and Makhzani Afghani, highlighting accounts that he thinks support his theory.
Okay, like what kind of accounts are we talking about?
Well, for example, one of the accounts he mentions is the story of the Prophet Muhammad. He gave a blessing to this group of Afghan chiefs who claimed to be descendants of the lost tribes of Israel.
Huh. Interesting.
So Ahmad sees this as further proof that there were Jewish communities in Asia, which would make it more plausible that Jesus could have reached those people during his travels.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And to further back that up, he mentions all these travelogues and research that support the Jewish origin of Afghans and Kashmiris, supporting that idea that those lost tribes, they could have settled in those regions.
Right, I see. So he's building a case for a Jewish presence in those areas, which would make it more likely that Jesus would have gone there.
Exactly.
It's like he's connecting the dots.
He is. He's connecting the dots. And there's also Josephus, the famous historian.
Yeah, I know Josephus.
Ahmad brings him into the argument, too, because Josephus actually wrote about Jewish tribes living in Persia and beyond.
Right. That would definitely support the idea that Jesus could have, connected with those communities.
Exactly. Okay, and then there's one book that Ahmad really seems to focus on. It's called the Makhzani Afghani. He's especially interested in the stories in this book about the Jewish origins of the Afghans and their possible connection to King Saul.
Makhzani Afghani. So this book seems to have a lot of weight for him.
It does, yeah. Especially when it comes to backing up his argument.
Okay, so we've got coins, we've got historical accounts, we've got travelogues, we've got Josephus, and now we have this Makhzani Afghani book.
Yep, he's pulling from everywhere. He even brings up historians who believe that Jesus visited India before the crucifixion, possibly to learn from Buddhist teachings.
Oh, interesting. So like a fact-finding mission, maybe?
Yeah, but Ahmad, he disagrees with that. He insists that Jesus' journey happened after the crucifixion, and he suggests a pretty interesting reason why we might not have more evidence of this journey.
Oh, okay. What's the reason?
Politics. He points to the political climate of the time, saying that a lot of nations were hostile towards Islam back then, and that this hostility could explain why, documentation of Jesus traveling to the east, why it might be scarce or maybe even suppressed altogether.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's like if these travels were seen as a threat to certain powers, they might have tried to erase that history.
Right. And it reminds us that, history can be manipulated, it can be influenced by power dynamics, and sometimes certain perspectives just get silenced or overlooked.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to always think critically about the stories we're told and consider the perspectives that might be missing.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so Ahmad also draws this parallel between, Jesus' time in the tomb and Jonah's time in the whale's belly. He uses that biblical story of Jonah to support his theory that Jesus could have survived, a seemingly impossible situation.
Right, the Jonah story. So he sees that as like a symbolic representation of what Jesus went through, emphasizing that God's power can overcome anything, even death.
Exactly. Another really important point that Ahmad emphasizes is that Jesus was honored in the East.
So like a contrast to how he was treated back home.
Exactly. Ahmad uses this verse to suggest that maybe Jesus found acceptance and respect in India, which was completely opposite from the rejection and persecution he faced in Judea.
So he's basically saying that Jesus' mission was to find those lost tribes of Israel and to spread his message of peace and love to the East, where he was welcomed.
Yes, exactly. And to back up this claim, he dives into specific verses from the Quran. For example, he points to verse 3.55. It says, "I will take thee and raise thee to myself."
Raise thee to myself.
Yeah.
I see where he's going with this.
He interprets that as a metaphorical ascension, not a literal one. He focuses on the idea that God saved Jesus from this humiliating death on the cross and allowed him to live out his days with dignity.
Wow. So he's really challenging the traditional Christian understanding of Jesus' ascension.
Yeah, and it's not just the Quran. He analyzes passages from the Gospels, too.
Oh. Give me an example.
Well, remember the story of Pilate's wife having that dream about Jesus?
Oh, yeah, right. She begged her husband to spare Jesus.
Yeah, and Ahmad suggests that even some of the Roman officials, even they had their doubts about whether Jesus was guilty or not.
Interesting. So he's suggesting there might have been this hidden effort to save Jesus, even among the Romans.
Exactly. He uses that to support his argument that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. And then there's the story of Jesus appearing to his disciples in Galilee after leaving the tomb.
Right.
He focuses on those specific details.
Yeah.
Jesus showing them his wounds, eating with them, traveling with them.
Okay, and what's he getting at with those details?
Well, he argues that all those things would have been impossible if Jesus had been resurrected in a spiritual body.
Okay, I get it. So he's saying that Jesus was physically present in the flesh after the crucifixion.
Yep. And to back that up even further, he says that Jewish tombs back in those days, they weren't like modern tombs. They were actually pretty spacious and well ventilated, which means that Jesus' tomb could have been a suitable place for him to recover from his injuries.
That's an interesting point.
And he even compares Jesus' tomb in Jerusalem to the alleged tomb in Srinagar, Kashmir.
Oh, really? What's the comparison?
He points out their similarities, like he's trying to create a visual link between those two locations, suggesting a continuity in Jesus' journey.
I see, yeah.
And he also emphasizes that Jesus didn't have to go through the full extent of the crucifixion. Like, he wasn't on the cross for 3 days, and his bones weren't broken because of the Jewish custom of removing bodies before the Sabbath.
Right, because of the Sabbath.
So he's basically highlighting the unique circumstances that allowed for Jesus' survival.
Okay, so he's really piecing together a detailed picture here, trying to show how all these different factors could have contributed to Jesus surviving the crucifixion.
Exactly. And he even mentions that there was a dust storm during the crucifixion.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, so he's saying that all the chaos caused by the storm could have helped Jesus get taken down from the cross without anyone noticing.
That's clever. He's using those historical details to support his theory. It's like he's saying, look, this wasn't just some straightforward event. There's more to the story.
Exactly. He also analyzes Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was arrested. When he prayed all night and he was really distressed and he was pleading with God to save him.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful scene.
Right. And Ahmad argues that God would never have ignored such a sincere prayer from a prophet like Jesus.
So he's appealing to our emotions here, too, highlighting Jesus' humanity and his desperation.
Exactly. And he even mentions the gospel prophecy that some of Jesus' disciples wouldn't die until they saw him coming in his kingdom. Remember that one?
Yeah, I remember reading that. But how does that tie into his theory?
Well, he argues that that prophecy couldn't have been fulfilled by some kind of spiritual return or vision, like some Christians believe. He says it has to refer to Jesus returning physically in the flesh after the crucifixion.
I see. Yeah. He's pulling together these different interpretations of biblical prophecies to support this idea of Jesus traveling to India.
Exactly. And then there's that gospel account of the graves opening up and all the saints rising from the dead after Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah, that's a wild one. But I thought Ahmad was trying to prove that Jesus survived. Why would he focus on dead people coming back to life?
Well, instead of accepting that account as literal truth, he challenges it.
Oh, okay. How so?
He argues that if that event had really happened, with all those saints coming back to life, it would have been such a huge miracle that everyone would have believed in Jesus right then and there.
Right. It would have been impossible to deny.
Exactly. But, he points out, the Jews still didn't believe in Jesus, even after this supposed resurrection of all these saints.
That's a good point. So what's he saying? That the account's exaggerated? Or maybe symbolic?
Maybe. He's definitely challenging the literal interpretation. He says there are no records of these resurrected saints actually speaking or testifying to Jesus' divinity.
So it's like he's saying, if this really happened, wouldn't we have heard more about it?
Exactly. He uses that lack of evidence to question the whole story and suggests that maybe it was added to the Gospels later just to make Jesus seem more powerful.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. So he's basically implying that parts of the Gospels might not be entirely accurate.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of looking at things.
So is he saying that the whole story is made up? Or does he offer an alternative interpretation?
He does offer an alternative. He suggests that maybe it was based on a vision or some kind of spiritual experience that got interpreted literally later on. He even references a book on dream interpretation called Tatirul Anam.
Tatirul Anam, okay. What does that book say?
It says that dreams about dead people coming back to life, they can symbolize deliverance from persecution.
Ah, I see. So he's suggesting that this whole account of the saints rising, it might have a deeper symbolic meaning. Maybe it represents Jesus' escape from the cross, his deliverance from death.
Right. It's a reminder that religious texts can be interpreted in different ways and that the literal interpretation isn't always the right one. Sometimes there's a deeper meaning hidden beneath the surface.
It's fascinating how Ahmad weaves all these different interpretations together to build his case. He's really pulling from a wide range of sources, from religious texts to historical accounts to even medical evidence. It's really impressive, whether you agree with them or not.
It really is. He's meticulously pieced together this incredibly complex argument to support his theory that Jesus journeyed to India. Whether you find it convincing or not, it definitely makes you think. It challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about Jesus and explore these alternative narratives that, they question those traditional interpretations.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is full of mysteries and that there's always more to learn.
For sure. And this is just the beginning. We've got a lot more to unpack from Ahmad's book.
I'm ready for more. Let's keep diving.
Couldn't agree more. Ahmad seems to be really focused on disproving that traditional Christian belief that Jesus ascended to heaven in a physical body.
Right, right. He argues that if Jesus had really been resurrected and glorified, he wouldn't have had to run away from the Jews or keep his appearances secret.
It's like he's saying, if Jesus was really all-powerful now, wouldn't he act differently?
Exactly. And he brings up that point about the disciples being afraid after Jesus' supposed resurrection.
Oh, yeah, that is weird when you think about it. Why would they be scared if they thought he was invincible now?
Right. And Ahmad uses that fear as evidence that Jesus was still human, still vulnerable, still subject to danger, not this divine being that couldn't be harmed.
So he's really trying to challenge that whole idea of a glorified body that the Gospels talk about?
Yeah. He argues that if Jesus had come back in a spiritual form, he wouldn't need to eat or sleep or show his wounds to prove who he was.
He makes a good point.
It's a very down-to-earth, practical way of looking at it. And he even takes on that whole story about the disciples stealing Jesus' body.
Oh, yeah. That one's always been kind of fishy.
Right. Like, how would the guards know the body was stolen if they were asleep?
Exactly. It doesn't really add up.
And Ahmad suggests that it was just a story made up to cover up what really happened, that Jesus survived.
So he's asking us to really look closely at the details and question the traditional narrative.
Exactly. And to consider the possibility that things might not have happened the way we've always been told.
It's a good reminder to never stop asking questions and always be open to new perspectives.
Now it's up to each person to weigh the information and decide what makes sense to them.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that this deep dive, it's really just a starting point, right? If this theory has piqued your interest, I encourage you to check out those sources we mentioned and dig a little deeper on your own.
Yeah, definitely. And we've got links to some of those sources in the episode description, so you can start there.
Perfect.
And even if you don't end up agreeing with Ahmad's theory, I hope this whole exploration has opened your mind a bit. Encouraged you to question some of those assumptions we often have about history, about religious narratives, to look at things from a different angle.
Yeah, totally. It's been such a fascinating journey, exploring the arguments, the sources, all the implications of this, like really unconventional theory.
It really has. And that's what the deep dive's all about, right? Yeah. We're not here to give you the answers. We want to spark your curiosity, get you thinking critically, and inspire you to keep exploring these mysteries of history and religion.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating look into history and religion. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning.